Hello, today I'm going to be talking about The Darkness That Comes Before by R. Scott Bakker. This is book 1 in the Prince of Nothing trilogy. This is not your escapist fantasy. It is dark, it is bleak, it is complex, and it is violent and brutal. Yes, to all people, but especially towards women. I'm going to circle back to this point later in the review, but I just wanted to mention it here at the beginning because I am personally glad I knew that going into the trilogy. This book opens with a Nietzsche quote, and I actually missed that as I was reading the book. Jimmy from the Fantasy Network kindly pointed that out to me, and it helped me bring some context to some of the themes I was seeing presented. And it actually opens up with some interesting lines as well in the prologue. So there's the epigraph quote: "If it is only after that we understand what has come before, then we understand nothing. Thus we shall define the soul as follows, that which precedes everything." And then there's the opening line, "One cannot raise walls against what has been forgotten." So I think that highlights some of the themes that are going to be presented in this story regarding identity and history repeating itself, or repercussions from the past catching up with us in the present. And so there's definitely an ominous tone that's set up right at the beginning. There is this mysterious apocalypse that takes over in the prologue, and you see the aftermath of that, and a young boy who is a lone survivor of this apocalypse escape and come across these mysterious people called the Dunyain people. We learn more about these mysterious Dunyain people later in the story through a character named Kelus. But after that prologue with the young boy, we then go 2,000 years in the future, and there's the threat that this apocalypse could reemerge and this no-God force. There was a lot in this book that remains mysterious to me. At the same time, there were so many things that I found fascinating and intriguing that kept me turning the page, and I'm sure a lot would come into greater perspective, one, upon further reading in the series, but also upon rereading and upon discussion. So this is a very richly layered book. And what I did understand about the book is that the whole setup is for a holy war that will take place. This book is a setup book, so much so that the last few pages in the book actually read like the introduction to many books. So I did spend a great deal of time at the beginning of the read going through the appendices and familiarizing myself with the different factions of the world and their backstories and histories. I haven't read any books yet by Ken Liu, but I understand that book 1 in the Dandelion Dynasty, The Grace of Kings, is rich with a historical overview of the world. I would describe this book very much the same way, and it never felt dry because of Bakker's incredible prose. You cannot hear about this author without hearing what a magnificent writer he is, and I agree with that. He has a way of writing quotable, memorable sentences that are just in the flow of his writing. He doesn't even need to highlight these sentences at the beginnings of paragraphs or ends of paragraphs or italicize them in any way. His writing doesn't draw too much attention to itself. It never feels ostentatious. And for that reason, I feel as though he shows great confidence and command over his craft as a writer. And it added so much depth and nuance to the world, to the history, and to the characters. And so the characters in this world, we follow a few different perspectives, and they could seem a little archetypal. So we have that character Kelus I briefly mentioned at the beginning, who's a Dunyain person, and he is somewhat reminiscent of Paul from Dune in that he has these skills, kind of like prescience, but in his case, he's able to kind of see the mappings and inner workings of each person and the muscles on the face and the sort of causes and inner workings of the mind, or what has come before. There's a lot of cause and effect that's explored in this book. And he's able to sort of figure people out, figure out their motivations, figure out what drives them, figure out how to manipulate them. So he's actually a very creepy character. And then we have a tribesman warrior type character, a plainsman, who is somewhat reminiscent of Conan because he's a very skilled fighter, but also has a lot of critical thoughts about society and civilization. And then we also have a sorcerer, a prostitute, a lot of interesting characters that could seem like cookie cutter cutouts, but they're not, because Bakker, again, has such a skill with writing. He has a way of just bringing out so many layers of complexity to the inner psychology of each of these characters. And you see how each of these characters is sort of driven by their different backgrounds, their different social class, political ideologies or religious ideologies, and this all informs different perspectives on war. As I said, this is the setup of a holy war. And even though this is the setup of a holy war, there is a great battle that takes place in this book. And I don't want to say too much to avoid spoilers, but I will say I was personally immersed. I thought it had a lot of great twists and turns. There was just a lot to unpack in that one scene alone. The magic in this world is very morbid and grisly, and it's left mysterious to an extent, but there are these objects called kores, and these objects, these marbles, I think is how they're described, they have this ability to sort of dispel sorcery and in that way even the playing field when it comes to magical skill versus other types of skill. And there are different schools of sorcery in this world as well. This book shows humanity at its cruelest, and yet there is a bit of a sardonic humor that comes out now and then, especially in the way certain characters think and act, especially noble characters, and the way that they'll project their own personal ideas of behavior and motivation onto people from different backgrounds. And there are several themes explored in this story, just to name a few. Fanaticism as we're setting up for this holy war, so ideas of faith as well. And identity, as I mentioned, with the Nietzsche quote, determinism, causality, cause-effect relationships, and whether we mistake effects for causes. And agency, as you can imagine, also with all of that, and Nietzsche being at the beginning again. And even with this Nietzsche quote, I'll go ahead and read it. I shall never tire of underlining a concise little fact which these superstitious people are loath to admit, namely that a thought comes when it wants, not when I want. So again, this sort of speaks to agency, whether we have any, and if we don't, who or what is this puppet that's pulling the strings? So one of the things that was coming up for me personally in my thoughts as I was reading this book was Easter mysticism and the Advaita Vedanta inquiry practice called Neti Neti, which is Sanskrit for not this, not this. This is a practice in which you look within yourself and you recognize the different objects of awareness. So thoughts, feelings, sensations, memories, and you recognize that none of these exact objects are who and what you are. So you're not your body, you're not your thoughts, you're not your memories, you're not your emotions, then who or what are you? So you're left with nothing at the end of that. And that nothingness kind of, I think, hints at that darkness that comes before. But in this case, I think there is a much more sinister quality to that darkness, and so I am intrigued with that. I'm not saying that Bakker was inspired by Eastern mysticism, it's just something that came up for me personally, and I found it really interesting, especially with that character again, Kelus, and what he is making of that, and how he is understanding the self, and that reference point, or lack thereof. So that is something I'm very curious about moving forward in this series, and especially as that relates to lack of agency or lack of free will. That's a good segue for me to talk about the female characters. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is a brutal world towards women. It is a patriarchal world, and there are two main female perspectives. One is Esmenet, a 31-year-old prostitute who's considered past her prime because she can't compete with women who are much younger than she is, even though her customers are men who have gray hair, who are aging. She's not worth as much to them as younger women. So she's looking at a life of doom and gloom because there's not much else for her. And then there's a young woman named Serwe, who's a former concubine but becomes the prized possession of a tribesman through battle. It's just devastating to see how these women equate their self-worth with their sexual value and what they mean to men as what they mean in life. And you also see how women hate other women because they're competing for survival to be the sexual desire of other men. Men are a means to survival, and being sexually desirable is a means to survival. So it's definitely difficult to be a woman in this world, especially an aging woman. And these women are so hard on themselves. What I found interesting was Esmenet's perspective. Now, Esmenet's backstory is that she had a young daughter who died, and so she's just trying to make meaning out of her life as someone who lost a child. Anyone who has lost a child, I have not had children, but I imagine that that alone is a difficult thing to bear. And at the same time, she is trying to expand her worldview through the men she sleeps with. So I'm going to go ahead and read a section of Esmenet. And I understand if this might be considered slightly spoilery. I don't think it really is. But if you want to skip this section, I'll go ahead and leave a timestamp below. But I think this provides some context on how women see other women in this world, primarily prostitutes. All prostitutes ranked their custom according to their tastes. Some liked large men, others small. Some favored priests with their hesitant, uncalloused hands, while others favored soldiers and their rough confidence. But Esmenet had always prized experience, those who had suffered, who had overcome, who had seen faraway or astounding things. These were the men she prized. When she was younger, she had coupled with such men and thought, now I'm part of what they've seen. Now I'm more than what I was. When she pestered them with questions afterward, she did so as much to learn the details of her enrichment as out of curiosity. They left lightened of both silver and seed, but she had convinced herself that they took some part of her with them, that she had expanded somehow, that she, Esmenet, haunted eyes that watched and warred with the world. So her means of being part of the world, of seeing beyond her limited domain, is by sleeping with other men and feeling like she's becoming more a part of the world, which she can't otherwise be a part of because she is marked. She does have a tattoo on her hand marking her as a prostitute, marking her as a low social class, and she just knows that there's not much else for her. So that's her way in. And there's another part that further adds to this perspective. Men needed to be more. This is why she had decided so many of them gambled. They sought coin, certainly, but they also yearned for a demonstration, a sign that the world, the gods, the future, someone had somehow set them apart. So they told her stories, thousands of them over the years. They smiled at their accounts, thinking they thrilled her, as they had when she was young, with knowledge of just who had betted her. And with one exception, none of them guessed that she cared nothing for what their stories said about them, and everything for what their stories said about the world. So she's playing this game with these men, letting them think that she's kind of helping them feel special or that she thinks they're special, and therefore kind of playing into their desires, their sexual desires, to feel important in the world, to feel like what they've done in life matters. But really, her real end goal is just to get the stories from them. It's less about them being the centerpiece of their stories. It's just about the story of the world at large. And this is her means to achieve that goal, to get those stories. So it's a very sad picture, but I think you can get a taste of just also how layered and complex these women are, at least Esmenet for me so far. I will be in a discussion about this series over on Philip Chase's channel with Jimmy from the Fantasy Network and Raph Blue Taxed, and I know we're going to have some fascinating things to say about this book. So I hope you'll join me there if you want to hear spoiler thoughts. But in general, I am very eager to get to the second book. I was pretty fascinated with what Bakker has set up, and I'm very curious to see where it goes. So that is all for now. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.